Thank you, Walter. That's very kind and lengthy introduction made me embarrassed.
You're also humble.
So the other thing is I want to thank Shamira for all of her help in putting together some of the technological aspects of this presentation today. And I want to thank all of you for coming out. I don't know, hopefully you'll be able to see the screen. I don't know if how well you can see this.
Very well.
Good. There are a bunch of white gentlemen standing in front of a white, what
Palace.
could look like a white palace or a white castle. It's not the white castle that we know that gives sliders, etc. But this is a demographic that is predominant among gun owners in the United States. The estimation by Pew Research from 2013 to 14 is the 61% of U.S. adults who own guns are white men. More than twice the percentage in the adult population, and those white men, the majority were over 35 and self-identified as conservative Republicans. There's actually other research out there that suggests that it's a very tiny percentage of that white male population which actually has a massive number of guns, that is more than 5, 6, 7 weapons. So we're talking about a much smaller percentage of the population actually controlling a lot of the weapons, even though the United States now has one gun for every single person in this country. So we're talking about 360 million guns in this country. So what I'm interested in is not trying to cite recent statistics about gun ownership and gun violence, but I'm trying to get a better sense of how we understand how deeply rooted gun ownership, gun culture, and gun violence is in the United States. And that means what we have to do is often clear away a lot of myths that we have about the past. And in order to do that, I want to take a look at a couple of interpretive lenses, how we best understand gun violence. One of the more recent books dealing with guns talks about gun ownership and gun culture in relationship to social character and identity. And I think that's what makes it such an intractable and contentious discussion when we get to the issue of gun control. I'm not going to be talking about that, but I think the fact that people see it as part of their identity so strongly, and how that identity emerged over time is really important to understand. Secondly, another way of looking at it is the mythic meanings of gun ownership in particular, and the symbolic meaning. And this in the work by Richard Slotkin in particular called Gunfighter Nation. And what Slotkin and what I want to underscore here is the mythic significance we have assigned to the kinds of violence we have actually experienced, the forms of symbolic violence we imagine or invent, and the political uses to which we put that symbolism. And one of the things that Slotkin does is try to talk about that symbolic role of the gun in American past, even when, for example, for a long time, there was lots of gun control, primarily keeping guns out of the hands of African Americans, enslaved African Americans. It was also the case early on in the American colonies that Catholics couldn't own guns. That was part of the Protestant-Catholic War holdover. So throughout our history, and even when we think about the so-called Wild West, often if you went into these places on the frontier, the sheriff would usually say you had to turn in your weapon. So it's not like everybody was walking around with weapons as they now may have in concealed or open carry, which has become part and parcel of the phenomena of the proliferation of guns. So here's the other interpretive lens that I really want to look at. And this, I don't know how well you can actually see. This is a famous 1872 painting by a painter by the name of John Gast. Of course, probably the most prominent element in here is what?
Manifest destiny.
Yeah, manifest destiny. This represents manifest destiny, but it's represented as a kind of whiteness, a kind of innocence, a sense of progress, and a civilizing mission. She's actually holding a telegraph wire. And you see on the left, fleeing Native Americans. This is a highly ideological and idealized vision of that past. In fact, what was happening is ethnic cleansing, the use of weapons to ethnically cleanse Native peoples. You just see pioneers, and you see this whole civilizing mission and the idea that this is all bound up with progress, and those who stand in the way will just, as de Tocqueville pointed out when he commented back in the 1830s about how people saw Native people, how whites in general saw that, they thought that this was just the march of progress. Those who weren't on the immediate frontier and weren't wiping out Native peoples. So what's key then, as part of a historiographic lens, is what Walter Hickson discusses in his book, Settler Colonialism. American history is the most sweeping, most violent, and most significant example of settler colonialism in world history. Now, it's not the only example, right? There's certainly Canada, Australia, South Africa, Israel. All of these are settler colonialist nations. But what makes this, and I would argue, more violent and more sweeping, is that the United States has never gone more than a few years without waging war. And when you have war, and when you have racism together, as Dr. Martin Luther King talked about it in 1967 in his famous Riverside Address, you have what he's considered to be the triple evils: militarism, racism, and materialism. So, lest we believe, for example, that this is something of the past, the way in which we have hidden the real meaning of what has transpired. Those of you familiar with the popular historian David McCullough, he just came out with a new book called The Pioneers. And in The Pioneers, although this mostly talking about the Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787, this is another banner of, he promotes it as the great ideal. The Northwest Ordinance was the sense we wouldn't have slavery in the new territories, that's Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. There would be a respect for Native peoples. In fact, that was shredded almost the day it was promulgated. Because what transpired in the Northwest territories was a policy of ethnic cleansing, of settler colonialism, moving in, and as David Harvey has pointed out, how capital works, it's accumulation by dispossession. And in the case of Native peoples, it was accumulation by dispossession. In the case of enslaved Africans, it was accumulation by possession. That is, owning bodies, torturing bodies, enslaving bodies. So, let's talk a little bit then about what is my main thesis, that war and policing have accelerated the production and proliferation of guns and have normalized killing, especially, although not exclusively, of racialized others. Again, when you look at the history of American warfare, what you see is the ramping up of these proliferation of weapons. For example, the Mexican War in the 1840s. Colt, Smith & Wesson, all of these early manufacturers had a great boon delivered to them by this kind of warfare. And I think we begin to see that there are actually more deaths from gun violence just from 1968 to the present than there have been in all the deaths in prior wars. All right, so again, sticking with the kind of interpretive framework I think is essential if I'm going to be talking about war and policing, as I will be in later parts of this presentation. I want to highlight a couple of key references in terms of what we understand by the racial state, systematic racism, and the white racist frames. So racial states are states that historically become engaged in the constitution, maintenance, and management of whiteness, whether in the form of European domination, which was certainly the case as the European nations moved into other parts of the world, but even as they moved into Ireland, where they viewed the Irish as a different race. Colonialism, segregation, white supremacy, Karen folk democracy, Aryanism, and ultimately color blindness, another element of operating as a racial state. In Joel Fagan's essential book, Racist America, he talks about systemic racism includes a diverse assortment of racist practices. The unjustly gained economic and political power of whites, when we talk about white privilege, which is of course mitigated by class and location, etc. But these are part of the gains. As those who have written about cotton and the role of cotton in the United States, whether that's Sven Burkertz or Edward Baptist, it was essentially how the United States managed to expand its economic rise in the world, and it was done on the back, of course, of enslaved Africans. Finally, and another by Nicole Paul Singh, Race in America's Long War, racism and racial animus are not fixed characteristics of an already defined group of people. This isn't part of what, when one is born with a particular skin color, one is born with a particular ethnicity, it's not part of the genetic makeup. It is, however, part of the social, cultural conditioning and the historical circumstances that lead to, as he says, a situational dimension of our common political life that is repeatedly mobilized. And of course, we have an orange menace sitting in the White House continuing to mobilize that kind of animus for his own political benefit. All right, one further lens through which to understand this role of gun violence, which I will then, look at some specifics in terms of both war and policing. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's wonderful book called Loaded. For her, gun culture entitled white nationalism, racialized dominance, and social control through violence. And I'll talk more about that. The gun, Joan Burbick talks about gun show nation. And of course, we have something like 5,000 gun shows a year. Very little control over the sales at those gun shows. And in fact, one of the most reprehensible pieces of literature is often sold in those gun shows, called the Turner Diaries, which is a dystopian racist novel that was really loved by Timothy McVeigh. And if you remember who Timothy McVeigh was, he was the guy who blew up the Oklahoma City building that killed 100 and some people. So, gun functions to further racial oppression, economic disparity, and war. And here, if there's one book I would want you to read, this is the key text for me. Jonathan Metzl's recent book, Dying of Whiteness. He's both a psychiatrist and a sociologist, and he looks specifically at what guns and gun violence means. And when we talk about having 40,000 people a year dying of gun violence, not to mention the hundreds of thousands who are wounded, 2/3 of those are actually by suicide. And he looks at these rates of suicide, particularly among white people, and in states where there's been less control over guns, open carry, such as he looks specifically at Missouri, the rates of suicide among whites has gone up, hence the dying of whiteness. The intersecting trajectories of guns, whiteness, and privilege help explain why firearms convey particular meanings to specific populations and address why people who feel such privilege was bestowed by guns might be so loath to give them up. As he says, another part, guns have become almost totemic, like a totem or a fetish. So they carry that kind of almost supernatural power for some people. Now, one final clarification about the history of gun culture in this society. There continues to be a great deal of mythology around the Second Amendment. And in particular, the Second Amendment presumed by most people in this society, and certainly by gun owners in particular, that it's all about tyranny, protecting ourselves from the tyranny of government. Well, actually what it's about is slavery. When James Madison, when Madison came to write the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights essentially, as a Virginia holder of enslaved people, he was well aware that his other slave owners were very concerned about the new federal government, and was very concerned that the new federal government might actually take over state militias. And state militias were absolutely essential in the South for putting down any possibility of insurrections by enslaved Africans. And so this goes back to South Carolina supported the Second Amendment, wrote in 1779, all white men in the province of military age were soldiers as well as citizens and trained in some measure to the use of arms. They were obliged to be ready for defense, not only against incursions of Indians, but also against the insurrection of Negroes. The hidden history of the Second Amendment, the militia remained the principal means of protecting the social order and preserving white control over the black population. This is why, when we talk about the Second Amendment, we cannot rely on the mythic potency of what the Second Amendment represents. We actually have to go back and look at what the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights represents. And although there's certainly ideals that are in that Bill of Rights and Constitution, this was a slave document of a slave republic. And unless we grapple with all of the implications of the deep-rootedness of white supremacy in our history, we're never going to be able to come clean on truth and reconciliation, which is what essentially is absolutely necessary, something that South Africa did after the final overthrow of apartheid. All right, so now I'm going to apply those interpretive lenses to these two particular areas of concern, one on war making and the other on policing. And some of these images are going to be rather graphic and disturbing because, in fact, that's the history. So I want to begin by unpacking the history of weaponized whiteness, exterminating the Native Americans from the Pequot War to Wounded Knee. Pequot War back in the 17th century, in the American colonies, Wounded Knee in 1890. And this is a pattern of settler colonialism. Now, this particular mural, by the way, has been in the news recently. This is a mural painted back in the 1930s in George Washington High School in San Francisco. And starting in the 1960s, because of some of the images, particularly the images of enslaved Africans, people in the Black Power movement were upset that this seemed to just rely on victimization and not talk about agency. And so there were beginning criticisms of this. The criticisms now actually came to a full-blown controversy in the last year and a half in San Francisco. The Board of Education initially voted to destroy the mural. There was a lot of pushback from loads of people, including Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and others, to this. But fundamentally, this was a counter-narrative to what we saw in the John Gass painting, to the vision of the United States. Here's George Washington, probably with pointing to the new territories in the Northwest, or the Northwest Ordinance opened up. Here are these trusty pioneers going off. But below that is the body of a murdered African American. And of course, opening up these territories was primarily all about ethnic cleansing again and settler colonialism. And the very university we sit in, the very road that's outside of the very reference to Wayne is based upon Mad Anthony Wayne, who was one of the leaders of ethnic cleansing throughout the Northwest Territories, as they were called.
Fran, what's the scene in the right corner there?
So here you have somebody sitting down actually with a native, a chief, and trying to come to a treaty. Now, of course, that's exactly what happened. You had a mix of ethnic cleansing through violence, through militias, through the military, and at the same time, you had an effort to try to promulgate a series of treaties which were hardly worth the paper they were printed on, because as soon as they were issued, those treaties with the movement west would be broken. And we know that's, you know, the whole history of this. So
Donald Trump just gave us an example with the Kurds.
yes, exactly. Another betrayal of people of color in order to, you know, satisfy the particular orientation of the political elite, in this case, you know, Trump. All right, so the Pequot War, for those of you who didn't know, it was the first full-scale Anglo-Native conflict. And for the perspective of the settlers, it was a providential victory. And of course, everything about Manifest Destiny, as you've read about it, was blessed by the idea that this is God on the march and with God on our side, as Bobby Zimmerman sang his song, Bob Dylan. So the Indian Wars, as they were known in colonial America, were essentially unremitting borderland violence, affirmed the increasingly homogenized colonial discourse that framed Indians as a unitarian savage foe in the path of civilization progress and national independence. And again, it's not to say that Native peoples were, you know, these pacifists. They were not. They waged war on each other, but the war wasn't exterminationist wars, which is what was waged by these settlers and by the nation, the new nation, on Native peoples. So we have a myth that Slotkin talks about of savage war. It became a basic ideological convention of a culture that was increasingly devoted to the extermination or expropriation of the Indians and the kidnapping and enslavement of black Africans. And it's all, the notion of progress is deeply imbricated, deeply part and parcel of the idea of race war, with whiteness representing civilization and with those of racialized others representing primitivism, etc. And Jeannie Latte's recent book, Wars for Empire, which really studies the whole history in the Southwest of the war on Apaches. The United States was born, manufactured, and maintained through conquest and war. And it's within that cauldron of conquest and war that, you have the proliferation of weapons and guns and the normalization of killing of racialized others.
Is that a projection of, I hope you don't mind me saying,
Yeah.
Is that a projection of actually the savages, war makers of the whites?
Yes.
And they're projecting their own savagery onto the natives?
Yeah, that's exactly what my first chapter in my new book is about. Is savage war was basically based upon that projection. And it was the savagery, as we see in this picture at the Wounded Knee Massacre, which is promulgated by the settler colonialist society. This was in 1890, and this was a moment when the Lakota had been more and more corralled into areas of reservation. And what they started doing is a kind of revitalization movement, which was known as the ghost dance. The ghost dance was seen by those outside, particularly by the white power structure, as somehow a threat. And so what you had happen was US troops were sent in to disarm the Lakota. And this isn't the first time when people are sent in to disarm, and I'll talk more about that in particular with African Americans. And the troop basically fired on this peaceful group of men, women, and children, killing at least 300 that we know of. And this is this deep trench that was plowed out and into which the bodies of Native people were put. I'm sure you've heard of L. Frank Baum, you know, the Wizard of Oz guy. Probably read him and thought about how innocent all of that was. Well, L. Frank Baum, who happened to live in South Dakota, wrote for the magazine, which is where the Lakota Massacre, where the Pine Ridge was, and where this Wounded Knee Massacre was. In his newspaper in January 3rd, 1891, he said, "Our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians." That was unfortunately too much of a dominant ideological position of so many people. This Lakota, this Wounded Knee would come back again in 1973 when there was a standoff between the American Indian movement and the FBI. There were some people killed, but one person blamed for some of that killing who never really proved, but languishes in prison, Leonard Peltier. So this is one instance. Finally, when, and as Hickson and others point out, as the United States then moves outside of the continental US, it moves to fighting wars elsewhere in the world with the same kind of racial tropes that operated here in US war in the Philippines in 1899 to 1902. There were a variety of different visions of the Philippines as Indians, the Philippines as the N-word. In fact, if Indian was the racial epithet for Filipinos preferred by the High Command and many who had fought in the Indian Wars, the second most popular, the one preferred by the rank and file, was the N-word. And in this war, we have almost a preface to what other wars will happen in the 20th century and in the 21st century, when even children, Filipino children, children of color, are shot down and killed. And the most prominent one is, of course, in the more recent war, is the My Lai Massacre, which happened in 1968, but was not even revealed fully to the public until 1969. And when it was, even though only one person was charged with these murders, Lieutenant Calley, he was later pardoned by Richard Nixon. And we have a pattern that also Donald Trump is following. People who have been charged by the military themselves of committing war crimes, are potentially being, could be pardoned by Donald Trump. And to bring it up even to the more recent, I don't know how many people have seen the movie American Sniper. Anybody? It's about, it's a Clint Eastwood film that came out in 2014 based upon the autobiography of Chris Kyle, who was a Navy SEAL who boasted of having killed 250 people during his 4 deployments in Iraq. The film focuses on how troubled Chris Kyle is, but in fact, when you read his autobiography, he spews the most vicious racism, calling the Iraqis raghead savages, just talking about wanting to really blow them away. And again, so you have another cultural artifact that provides a gauze over what really transpired in that war, and particularly this particular character. Okay, so I want to move from that arena of war to now about policing. And I think this is really important to understand that one of the main threads for police in the United States was slave patrols, rooted deeply in the role of slave patrols. It's not surprising then that the modern slave patrols will shoot down 12-year-old kids like Tamir Rice in Cleveland, or shoot down kids around the country of people of color. So guns and slavery were intimately associated with each other. All slave raiding relied on guns, and all slave holding relied on armed repression. This was true even when, through the valiant insurgency, W.B. Du Bois talks about it in Black Reconstruction in the Civil War, that African Americans get up, fight back, and finally achieve through the 13th and 14th Amendment recognition. Even that recognition, when they attempt to then utilize the Second Amendment for their own protection of armed self-defense, they are attacked by the new forms, by white supremacist gun violence, the White League, the KKK. All of these were all about gun control, taking away guns from African Americans, and murdering them in the process. And not only then murdering them in the process, that has happened in Colfax, Louisiana, and we can go through incident after incident after incident, whether it's in the 20th century, East St. Louis, Tulsa, Detroit. I mean, it's on and on. And the reason it's such a continuous thread is this connection, as I would argue, between gun violence and racism. So when some of those murderous whites who shot down and killed blacks in Colfax, Virginia, Colfax, Louisiana, when their case went to the Supreme Court, they were exonerated. So again, it's not surprising that the court, still operating under the doctrine of white supremacy, would uphold this. And of course, vigilante violence and state terror were endless throughout the movement to fight back and gain real political citizenship for African Americans, especially, although not exclusively, in the South in the 1950s and 60s. Medgar Evers was one of those, shot down, killed by Brian Della Beckwith. In his first two trials, he was never found guilty. It was only later when they tried to, because they realized under the system in the South that juries would just let people off. This wasn't seen as murder. And that's why it led Ella Baker, the great godmother, in effect, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, an African-American activist. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens. There's actually a great song based upon that Ella Baker reference by Sweet Honey and the Rock.
And that's Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it is. So what we have now is, since the 1970s in particular, for the first 100 years, the National Rifle Association, which was founded in 1871, was essentially a sportsman's club. In 1970, there is a palace revolt in effect. And the real hardliners and lobbyists for gun manufacturers take over the NRA and begin promulgating the idea that gun ownership is the right of everybody as opposed to being related to militia, an individual right instead of a collective right, that you should be able to carry guns wherever you want to, you know, and as what happens transforming this castle doctrine, you defend yourself if you are, in fact, your home is invaded. Although we know, again, if somebody is seeking help, as we saw a couple of years ago, right, an African-American young woman knocking on somebody's door and then blown away, right, by the guy inside. So stand your ground, this kind of gun violence perpetuating itself. And in fact, what happens is, according to one study, when the shooting victim is black and the shooter is white, the case is 281% more likely to be ruled justifiable homicide than when people are of the same race. And of course, here's the litany, an unfortunate dishonorable role, I suppose, of all those who have been shot and killed by police. It is no exaggeration from Kienga's Jamata Taylor's book. It's no exaggeration to say that the men and women in blue patrolling the streets of the United States have been given a license to kill and demonstrate a consistent propensity to use it. More often than not, political violence, including murder and attempted murder, is directed at African Americans. The young people like Tamir Rice, who had a gun in a park in Cleveland. Police drove up. Within 2 seconds, the officer got out, didn't even give him a warning, got out, shot his weapon, killed Tamir Rice. That officer was not indicted. He was eventually let go, but he now is on another police force in Ohio. And this too often happens, although there have been cases where people, egregious cases of an off-duty officer, right, going up into the apartment and shooting somebody dead, that being found guilty. But one of the other things I think that makes this militarization and murdering of police is, since the 1990s, the Pentagon has operated a special weapons sale program, so-called 1033, that has armed local police departments with surplus weapons without any oversight. More than 11,000 local police agencies received over 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment in just the first 2 years of the program, a program that by the time of the murder of the unarmed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, provided more than $6 billion worth of equipment, some of which wound up missing. So this militarization, this militarization of the police, of SWAT teams, something, the tragedy that we had here in Detroit too, with the May 2010 death of 7-year-old Ayanna Jones, with a SWAT team, with this kind of militarization.
Whose presidency was that?
That would have been during this period of Barack Obama. But Obama, it wasn't the one that started this. Of course, it went through Clinton, Bush, and then Obama. And Obama tried to impose some restrictions in 2015 in response to all the demonstrations that occurred at Ferguson. But this is still very, very lax. And of course, what I think young people in particular have been able to do is to challenge these systems of policing, challenge these systems of gun violence and the militarization of killing, and talk about this, that, as Robin Kelly said about these protests, they remind us not only that Black Lives Matter, that should be self-evident, but that resistance matters. It matters because we are still grappling with the consequences of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and patriarchy. And of course, another amazing movement, multiracial in its focus, was the March for Our Lives, pretty much started by the kids from Parkland. Here you see Emma Gonzalez, who was one of those eloquent, moving spokespeople for March for Our Lives, but it was also very consciously multiracial grouping. These kids went from Parkland up to Chicago. They talked with high school kids in Chicago. It is a national tragedy, a national horror show that we have this, that my grandkids in New York City in public schools, 10 and 6, have to go through these kinds of drills. This is insane. This is traumatic. This needs to be confronted in the most deeply rooted way we can. And I think that's part of what the Peace Plan for a Safer America is one element of the way in which to address this. But I also want to suggest that these roots go very deep, and it will require us to wrestle with lots of things. With lots of things we've overlooked in our past, or lots of things which we don't want to look at in our past. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions and responses from the audience. I don't know to say that.
The Black Lives, the Stand Your Ground. Strategically, what happens is that the Western movement was the invasion, so you push them out and you exterminate them. And now that we have control of the fort, the plantation, the settler home, now we have to defend our castle against the invasion of the people we displaced.
That's right.
So stand your ground is, okay, we conquered you, but you're still not dead, so now, and now it becomes the enemy within,
right,
rather than the enemy outside.
Right, the Trayvon Martins who look to George Zimmerman as threatening, and therefore, they're taking out a weapon and killing somebody, unarmed person like that. And the Border Patrol, the whole history of the Border Patrol in 1924 is intimately connected with the establishment in 1924 of immigrant restriction, of keeping out, people of color, favoring in particular those from Northern Europe, something that Donald Trump is trying to do again. The Border Patrol was started in 1924. The KKK was enormously powerful in the 1920s, elected a mayor here, and in a lot of other cities. And the Border Patrol was filled with KKK members. And what they did to Mexican Americans, to Mexicans trying to cross the border, is is part of a horror show again of that kind of violence perpetrated. So when we look at the cages in which people fleeing from violence in their home countries in Central America, those people have been caged, at our border in Southwest. This is, again, has a longer history. In fact, back in the 1960s, there was an incident of putting people in these refrigerated cars who had been arrested at the border. So it has a longer history than just Donald Trump, although he's, as our vigilante-in-chief, not the commander-in-chief, but the vigilante-in-chief in the White House, he creates the kind of conditions under which you have the perpetuation of this kind of violence, in particular against people of color, and people seeking refuge from the kind of violence they confronted in their own countries. Yes, Frank.
I had heard on the radio yesterday that there had been over the Emmett Till incident, that they had put a monument, and
Right.
that got attacked.
Right.
And they built another monument.
Right.
And then they had a few more problems with that only recently, and that in a way this still strikes not only a chord, but reminds us of how touchy this situation was, even with historical things like the Emmett Till incident.
Yes.
So what does that say about,
Right.
where we are in terms of just
Yeah.
learning how to get along, I think.
Yeah, Timothy Tyson has a recent book on the whole Emmett Till incident and what happened, his murder in 1955, what transpired in the aftermath of that. And, you know, the reference here is that there was a monument but continued to be defaced, so they were trying to protect the monument. The same thing happened with the monument to Viola Liuzzo, the woman who had gone down from Detroit, who had been a part-time student here at Wayne State. In 1965, went to help down in Selma, and she was murdered by the KKK. Which I've been to, by the way, on that route between Selma and Montgomery, and that was often defaced. So I have a chapter in my new book where I talk about the whole history of these civil rights murderers, the way in which we're trying to have some restorative justice. It took 20, 30, 40, 50 years sometimes to get that kind of restorative justice, but we're still dealing with the whole history of these Confederate monuments, which were constructed primarily as monuments to the reinsertion of white supremacy into the rules and to the legislative agenda of the South. So, you know, these are still things that we are contending with. These are not easy solutions because the roots are so deep. But I do think we need the sort of truth and reconciliation commissions to be set up here that would deal with what has transpired with Native peoples. From Nick Estes's point of view, the recent pipeline in North Dakota, the struggle by Native peoples to protect their land, is just a part of the long history of war against Native peoples. You know, there's that long history is something we have to contend with. And even though when Wounded Knee happened in 1890, the soldiers who participated in that massacre were actually given medals by the Congress. 100 years later, under George H.W. Bush, there was an attempt to deal with the legacy of what really happened at Wounded Knee. Of course, almost at the same time that George H.W. Bush was doing that, he was sending his military into Panama that killed at least 3,000 poor Panamanians in Panama City. So the ironies, unfortunately, abound. Yes?
You mentioned earlier talking about like projection. What is a way to work around this extreme projection we see, like especially coming from the White House? Just today, Trump tweeted that he was the victim of a lynching.
Yes. I mean,
what is the way to confront that constructively, if there is one?
Yeah. Well, you know, the people who watch Fox News and the people who are part of the white identity cult that follows Donald Trump, it might be very difficult to be able to talk to them about why that reference is so detestable. Why?
Do they even care?
Well, that's what I mean. I mean,
They
some
don't even
people,
care.
some people may not care about it, but I
it's,
think
it's a non-conversation in so many ways that you try to be logical with the illogic, to try to be historical with the ahistorical. That's why it's so incredibly frustrating.
yeah,
And because and I think even more so, the lack of integrity. There is no interest in understanding. There is no interest, I think, in diffusing a lot of what's going on right now. And it's very, it's not even a strong enough word, extremely frustrating because it's been pushed to a level of confrontation that seems to be fueled on so many sides, and even just like having to watch him on the news or quoted on the
Yes,
CNN report or anything.
I know.
It's infuriating. because, not just because his horrible, ridiculous lies, but because it's so hateful.
And-
And what do you do with that?
Yeah, I think part of that is the fact that historical amnesia operates at such a popular level in this country, so that the whole history of lynching, which was one of those horrific devices used by white supremacists in the South in the late 19th and early 20th century, primarily, although not exclusively, against African Americans. Let's remember Leo Frank, a Jew, was also lynched. Out on the West Coast, Mexican Americans and Chinese were lynched. So it was, again, a tool to impose violence on racialized others. And that whole history, again, is something that people in this dehistoricized way in which language is used, people, see this as somehow, oh, he's just being hyperbolic, he didn't really mean it. Well, the point is, first of all, that there is the Constitution of the United States does provide the Congress with a remedy which is entirely constitutional and legitimate. It's called impeachment. So it hardly rises to what were these extra-legal mechanisms of lynching. And again, the whole history of it, this is that kind of projection. And it's a projection that resonates a lot with whites and with his base, because starting in the 70s, 80s, you began to have this kind of conservative, this right-wing backlash, so that now a majority of white people feel that they are more discriminated against than people of color in the society. So when you have that, when you have a majority of whites still believe, small, I mean it's 55% according to the polls, and when you have that, they can use these dehistoricized, ahistorical, ideological reference to lynching without any sense of shame, as it should be. They should have a profound sense of shame in using it.
Yeah, I just want to comment that sometimes we see this conflict between white and the rest of us. But there's a civil war happening here in this country between whites.
Right.
Not all whites are part of the white tribe.
Right.
People like Friend are humanistic, we love everybody. But what you get is that, again, because the majority of people in this country are white, it's a white civil war, and we're just sitting on the sides waiting for us to have a say in it, and we have to push our way in to say something, because the whites are arguing among themselves about what to do with the plantation folk. And of course, that embedded identity of white violence and power is supremely satisfying in terms of identity, because it gives you the power, and then once you got the power, you're not going to give it up. And it's no longer a matter, like you're saying, of reason. This is an irrational, this is my tribe, I don't care what my tribal leader does, I don't care how much violence, he is my tribal leader and I'm going to follow him over the cliff.
Okay. Any questions from this part? Any comments?
Thank you again.
Rebuttal? Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much.